this space. I'm kind of teetering on the edge, but I want to welcome you, Ruha Benjamin, Charlton McIlwain, Andre Brock, and Safiya Nova. I say you for last because I know you the best. Okay, so with that said, I would now like to introduce my esteemed colleague and friend, Dr. Terrence Wooten. He is in the Department of Black Studies, as well as I. And we're just excited to bring this group together. I mean, it's been a long time in waiting. I've been trying to get Safiya here for years, right? Ever since I've been here. So thank you for joining us on this panel. Now I turn it over to Dr. Wooten.
Hello, Sharon. Thank you for that introduction, and I want to echo the excitement. I have been really excited for this event since we came up with it together, particularly because it's sort of serendipitous. I knew that Sharon knew Andre and Safiya and wanted to bring them. And then I, being the inaugural scholar in residence at the Multicultural Center, wanted to bring Charlton and Ruha. And we did not think that we could do it at the same time because we were like, that will break the internet. And now we're about to break the internet. No. And so for me, you all are scholars that as an assistant professor, as a junior scholar, I came into knowing myself and my work through you. So it is an absolute pleasure to share space with you. Working with Sharon is always a pleasure, having her as a senior colleague and a mentor. And so building off of that intergenerational kind of collaboration, we couldn't think of a better moderator to have than Azadine Jackson. Azadine goes by Ozzy. He is a fourth-year PhD student in the materials department here at UCSB, where he studies complex magnetism and metals. I don't know what that means, but it sounds complex. He's also the co-president of the Black Graduate Student Association. So I'm going to hand it off to Ozzy, who will give a setup for how this is going to work today and also introduce our amazing panelists.
Thank you, Terrence. So first, I will introduce our panelists, and then I'll get into sort of what the rundown is going to be for the next hour and a half. So I'll start with Professor Charlton McIlwain. He is author of the new book, Black Software, The Internet and Racial Justice, From the Afronet and Black Lives Matter. Professor Charlton McIlwain is the Vice Provost for Faculty Development and Engagement at New York University and Professor of Media, Culture, and Communication at NYU Steinhardt. His work focuses on the intersections of computing technology, race, inequality, and racial justice activism. He has served as an expert witness in landmark U.S. federal court cases on reverse redlining / racial targeting and mortgage lending, and recently testified before the U.S. House Committee on Financial Services about the impacts of automation and artificial intelligence in the financial services sector. He writes regularly for outlets such as The Guardian, Slate's Future Tense, MIT Technology Review, and other outlets about the intersection of race and technology. Next, I would like to introduce our next panelist, Dr. Ruha Benjamin. Dr. Benjamin is a professor of African American Studies at Princeton University. She is the founding director of the Ida B. Wells Just Data Lab and an author of the award-winning book, Race After Technology, Abolitionist Tools for the New Jim Code, among many other publications. Her work investigates the social dimensions of science, medicine, and technology with a focus on the relationship between innovation and inequity, health and justice, knowledge and power. Professor Benjamin is the recipient of numerous awards and fellowships, including from the American Council of Learned Societies, National Science Foundation, Institute for Advanced Study, and the President's Award for Distinguished Teaching at Princeton. Next, I would like to introduce Professor Andre Brock, who is an associate professor of media studies at Georgia Tech. He writes on Western technoculture and Black cybercultures. His scholarship examines race in social media, video games, weblogs, and other digital media. His book, Distributed Blackness, African American Cybercultures, theorizes Black everyday lives mediated by network technologies. Last but not least, I would like to introduce Dr. Safiya Noble, who is an associate professor at UCLA in Information Studies and African American Studies, where she serves as the co-director of the UCLA Center for Critical Internet Inquiry. She is a research associate to the Oxford Internet Institute at the University of Oxford and is most notably known as the author of the best-selling book on racist and sexist algorithmic bias entitled Algorithms of Oppression, how search engines reinforce racism. So those are our four amazing panelists. The setup for the next hour is going to be, we're essentially going to have 60 minutes for our panelists to discuss anti-Blackness and technology and what STEM educators can do to address this now and in the future. And then we'll have 30 minutes for a question and answer session from our audience. And so I'd like to emphasize that if you have a question that you want to see answered in the question and answer, please use the Q&A function on Zoom. So with all that being said, I'd like to open the panel up to our panelists. The introductory question is, what is the relationship between anti-Blackness and technology for those who are unaware?
All right, I'm gonna jump in if it's okay. All right, great. I'm kind of visually oriented, a visual learner, and so I'm just gonna offer a few images and provocations to get us started, and then I'm gonna shut up, and I'm actually gonna set a timer so that I don't go too long. And so when posed this question, what's the relationship between anti-Blackness and technology, I wanna suggest starting first with the question of what we imagine as technology. And so rather than starting from a point of view of how Black people and communities are harmed by technology, I want us to begin to question, even exploding, what that word connotes for us, rather than conflating it with the hardware and software produced in Silicon Valley. I want us to go back and put ourselves in the origin story and as the innovators of not just the modern technologies, but going back further. And so we look, for example, at the work around algorithms and braiding, and we look at the work of Ron Eglash, African fractals, modern computing, and indigenous design. We go to appropriating technology, vernacular science, and social power. And then most recently, my edited volume, Captivating Technology, where again, Eglash is a contributor, but also the work of Natrice Gaskins and others who are helping us to understand in terms of the African diaspora, how Black people and communities have been producing tools, techniques, technologies long before the kind of modern internet or the emerging technologies that have a particularly harmful effect on many of our communities. And so moving from reorienting ourselves in terms of what we think of with technology, then we also need to go back to retrieve a longer history of how Black people and Black bodies have been hailed, to use my brother Andre Brock's notion of being hailed in terms of what automation has meant for Black life and Black labor. So if we go to 1930, Rastus Robot, the so-called mechanical Negro, built by Dr. Phillips Thomas and S.M. Kittner, to this ad from a 1957 Mechanics Illustrated magazine that says, the robots are coming. When they do, you'll command a host of push button servants. Reading the fine print, you see that robot slaves were seen as a replacement for the cheap and free domestic labor, the people who would dress you, comb your hair, and serve you meals in a jiffy. So when we think about anti-Blackness, I think it's also important to understand that the issues that we're talking about tonight are not inaugurated or created simply by new technologies, but there's this longer genealogy of Black labor and Black bodies being treated like mechanical objects. Then the other thing I want to put on the table here is to hold in the frame the more obvious forms of anti-Blackness, but also the more insidious, the more techno-beneficent forms of harm. And so it's along this spectrum that we can fold many different kinds of technologies. So on the obvious side, we have things like this healthcare algorithm that had a very, dramatic bias against Black patients. And there are reasons for those that we can talk about, but the headlines and both the research kind of throws it in our face, in which the kind of old school discrimination of the past, where we would just see a whites only sign on the hospital, is now replaced by what I call the new Jim Code, where the discrimination happens through this so-called veneer of objectivity of automated decision-making systems. But moving from the more obvious, we also need to hold in the frame the more insidious forms of anti-Blackness that come in the guise of helping or intervening in bias and discrimination. For example, hiring algorithms that promise to bypass the implicit biases of employers or human resource officers, but even these continue to perpetuate the same kinds of discrimination based on race, gender, et cetera. And so it's along the spectrum that we need to think carefully about the different kinds of conceptual tools, but also advocacy and movement tools that we need in order to address this kind of anti-Blackness. The other thing I want to put on the table here is to complement the important work that's happening around surveillance and facial recognition, kind of top-down, government-sponsored or privately sponsored forms of harm. I also want us to think about the everyday forms of anti-Blackness we might call not big brother, but little brother and little cousin, the kinds of surveillance tools that people use on their phones or rating systems, et cetera, in which we all become enrolled in a project of horizontal surveillance. So whether it's apps like Citizen that sort of map out so-called dangerous neighborhoods that we understand can easily go wrong given the everyday policing of Black life. And so it's along in this arena that I think we can complement the discussions that are focused on big actors, which needs to happen, to all the little actors, all of the ways in which the desire to track and surveil penetrates our own practices and our own thoughts. And so the main takeaways that I want to put on the table, rolling those 4 points together, are these. One, this idea that racism is productive, because many people are still taught to think of racism as an aberration, a glitch, an accident, an isolated incident, a bad apple in the backwoods and outdated, rather than innovative, systemic, diffuse, and attached incident, the entire orchard, in the ivory tower, in the tech industry, forward-looking, productive. And by productive, I don't mean in the normative sense, but in the literal capacity of racism to produce things. So even as we look at who tech-mediated discrimination harms, we need to also keep an eye on who is benefiting, who is profiting. Secondly, I'd like us to keep in mind that race and technology shape one another, because more and more people are accustomed to thinking and talking about the social and ethical impacts of technology, but that's only half of the story, because social structures, norms, values all exist prior to any given tech development. So it's not simply the impacts that we need to keep track of, but the inputs that make some inventions like a citizen app or a robot servant desirable or seem inevitable. Lastly, I want us to really take seriously imagination as a contested field of action, not an ephemeral afterthought that we have the luxury to dismiss or romanticize. So what is anti-Black imagination? Imaginaries animating our digital and physical infrastructures. Imagination is a resource, a battleground, an input and output of technology and social order. In fact, I want to suggest that most people are forced to live inside someone else's imagination. So one of the things we have to come to grips with is how the nightmares that many people are forced to endure are the underside of elite fantasies about efficiency, profit, safety, and social control. Racism, anti-Black racism, among other axes of domination, helps to produce this fragmented imagination where we have misery for some, monopoly for others. And so for me, this means that for those of us who want to construct a different social reality, one that's grounded in justice and joy, we can't only concern ourselves with critiquing the underside, only what is harmful or who is harmed, but also with who is benefiting, whose desires are being fulfilled by the particular socio-technical world that's being built. And so in closing this sort of initial reflection on this question of the relationship between anti-Blackness and technology, I want to bring in the words of critical race theorist and legal scholar Derek A. Bell, who told us to see things as they really are. Again, we have to imagine them for what they might be. Again, taking imagination seriously. And so with that, I want to counter the dominant, we might say hegemonic brand of technological development that is anti-Black with a more subversive imaginary. And so one example that I particularly like is the white collar early warning system that takes all of these mapping tools for looking for crime and turns it on its head and has its focus on white collar crime and look at areas in which crimes of capitalism are pervasive. And the developers in this case are even building a facial recognition system using the 7,000 images from LinkedIn, of CEOs from LinkedIn, in order to build this profile, which unsurprisingly is predominantly white and male. And so here we have a way of taking that Bellian framework, turning things on its head in order to see more clearly the perversity of tech-mediated profiling. And so the final thought here is that if inequity is woven into the very fabric of our society, and we see it in our educational system, our healthcare system, even our computer systems, then each twist, coil, and code is a chance for us to weave new patterns, practices, and politics. So the vastness of the problems that we're talking about tonight, I think, will be their undoing, precisely because they're everywhere, once we accept that we are pattern makers and that we can find ways, especially organizing in movements and working collectively in order to change these patterns. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing and shut up and turn things over to my brilliant colleagues. Thank you.
All right, I think I'm going to jump in right here, if that's okay with everybody. I've made the mistake before of following Dr. Benjamin, and I know the experience of getting lost in her words for all the reasons that you've all heard. So I prepared a few remarks for my opening. We'll talk a little bit some more beyond that, but I want to come in a same entry point and talking a little bit about origin stories in a historical context, reflecting on this question about anti-Blackness and technology. And so answering this question, what does anti-Blackness and technology mean for me, begins with W.E.B. Du Bois, whose words framing Blackness and anti-Blackness in the early 20th century presciently frame the relationship between Blackness, anti-Blackness, and technology. So Du Bois's words offer us many potential starting points, of course, for answer to this question. We could start with his well-known quote, "The problem of the 20th century is the problem of the color line." We could venture and answer this question by recalling Du Bois's famous question that he put out, which was, how does it feel to be a problem? But I want to start with a passage from the beginning of Du Bois's book, The Problem of the Color Line. There he wrote, "This 15th century phrase is stated baldly and bluntly by some classes. By others, it is dressed in 19th century clothes. It is said, we are dealing with facts, not theories of morality. There are among us a vast horde of people, alien to us in looks, in blood, in morals, and in culture. And our people will not associate with them and cannot live in peace beside them. They stand on a lower plane of humanity than we, and never have in the past evolved a civilization of their own. Nor under a favorable trial today do they show any ability to assimilate or forward modern culture. Therefore, as a lazy, shiftless, and bestial folk, they must, in accordance with the universal law of the survival of the fittest, yield before all conquering Anglo-Saxon, and must either be transported, isolated, or left to slow and certain extermination." This is the attitude, Du Bois said, that many Americans and Europeans have towards the Afro-American. It is an attitude that assumes with one stroke of the pen an answer to nearly every social question which this great problem presents. With little or no attempt at proof, it takes for granted that the present attitude of the American people towards the colored race is a fixed and unchangeable fact, not a prejudice of the day. Indeed, the problem of our current technological century is and continues to be the problem of the color line. The technology or technological tools we design and use that take up this attitude of Black inferiority, criminality, inhumanity, transform it into an unchangeable fact, not a prejudice of the day. And Du Bois helps us to understand that more than half a century of computer revolution has brought about technological change, but anti-Blackness remains and remains the same. And so when I think about anti-Blackness and technology, I'm reminded also of the words of Adam Clayton Powell Jr., who said this in 1960. "I shall not quote statistics. To do so would be a waste of your time and that of my staff. We know the Afro-American is last hired, first fired. His attacks on being Black. We know that he is quarantined regardless of ability and education, so that the highest achievement can be attained of only creature comforts. We know that he composes the largest number of unemployed in this nation today. We know that the new era of automation does not include him. When asked what does anti-Blackness and technology mean to me, I'm reminded of Dr. Shirley Jackson, who was one of the few Blacks and even fewer Black women admitted to MIT in 1964, when that university, which played an outsized role in this computer revolution, only admitted a single-digit number of Negroes. And when she became the first Black woman to earn a doctorate from the university in particle physics, a white senior professor touted MIT's new commitment to letting a handful more Black folks into the institution. And Dr. Jackson replied, "It was too damn little and too damn late." I'm reminded of W. Willard Wirtz, President Lyndon Johnson's labor secretary, who just days before the Voting Rights Act was signed, reminded us of Black people's already inferior position vis-a-vis new computing machines. In a newsletter titled Head-On Collision Between Civil Rights and Automation, he said, "Call it automation, cybernation, or age of the robots, the technological revolution is here and here to stay. Call it civil rights or equal opportunity or peaceable protest for freedom now, it is equally evident that the Negro Revolution is here." And then he went on to remind us that there are machines now which can play excellent games of checkers and pretty good games of chess. They can play a fair hand of bridge. They can interpret books. They are doing a good many ways skilled and unskilled jobs in the economy. They have no hands, but they can tabulate checks and they make no mistakes. They have no eyes, and yet they watch over the industrial process without ever blinking. And it has taken only 30 years to move from the fantasy of Rossum's universal robot to the reality of UNIVAC and its brother computers, and today's reality is more fantastic than the fiction of the 1920s. And so when asked this question about anti-Blackness and technology, I'm also reminded of Roy Wilkins, who in 1968 already foreshadowed Black people's early and enduring relationship to computing technology. For the Negro former farm worker, he said, the computer is but one more signal that he has been kept at arm's length while the rest of America pressed forward into the computer era. In the mass, he never got a chance to acquire the learning and the skills which would have enabled him to progress towards the use of data processing. He was not without ambition and initiative, but whenever he tried to move, he was slapped down. In 1910, for example, Arkansas Negro sharecroppers in Phillips County had their meetings shot up. When they shot back, the state militia began killing Negroes at will under the guise of suppressing an insurrection. It was not intended that these Black farmers should be permitted to take even the first step towards better farming and bigger earnings. And right there is where the American system of individual enterprise and reward on the basis of ability broke down. It is precisely at this point in thousands of family histories that the difference between opportunities for the unskilled white immigrant and those for the unskilled Black American became manifest. Finally, when asked, what does anti-Blackness and technology mean to me, I'm reminded of a time when the internet was Black, when it was teeming with Black people, entrepreneurs and activists, content creators and community organizers. A brief moment in time in the mid and late 1990s when Blackness thrived on the web and Black people were recognized for and profited from the cultural capital they built that had brought legions and legions of new users to a new medium that at the time had relatively few. I'm reminded that today Blackness and Black cultural production still animates the web and its platforms, but those who dominate and own these spaces have become content to capitalize on Black culture while foreclosing the ability for Black people to profit from our own work in significant ways. So I want to close my remarks and my thoughts with the words that I used to introduce my book, Black Software. Black Software is also a story about how computing technology was built and developed to keep Black America docile and in its place, disproportionately disadvantaged, locked up, and marked for death. It speaks to the nefarious ways that those in power use computing technology to destroy Black agency, nullify Black people's hopes and dreams, aspirations, human potential, and political interests. Its shockwaves reverberate and still define our present day. This Black software tells a story about American presidents, computing industry, corporate titans, the world's leading science and technology institutions, and it is a story about the civil rights revolutionaries who forced white America to its knees and the computer geeks who ushered in the computer revolution to lift white America back to its feet. It is a story about shadowy figures that I call the committeemen, the Black rage that flooded America's streets throughout the 1960s. These men, at the behest of their government, set America's founding principles of white supremacy loose to run amok in new computational systems that they designed and built. In between these two versions of Black software, the one I didn't talk about, the kind that positively impacts Black people's lives and the kind that destroys them, lies a more significant question. It's not a question about recently popularized concepts like computer bias or fair algorithms or platform inequality or digital ethics. It's a question that goes to the heart of the matter that these concepts merely skirt around. And that question is this: will our current or future technological tools ever enable us to outrun white supremacy? After all, this is not just our country's founding principle, it is also the core programming that preceded and animated the birth, development, and first uses of our computational systems. Thank you.
The hell am I supposed to present after all that? With every passing minute, I had to add another multi-syllabic word to my. Okay, y'all ready?
I 100% hate my life going last. I just want to put that
right now, for real. Like I'm like, who? What? Huh?
Yeah, I messed up.
I know it's a lie.
Right.
Should have gone first.
Give me 1 second. Let me get this together. I'm gonna share my screen. All right.
Got some Teddy Riley in you, I see.
You see that, right?
Taking your time. Cool.
Wow.
You share a screen, right? You can share a screen.
Screen sharing has failed to start. See, it's not me.
Oh, let me see what I can do with this. Okay, well, it says all panelists can share.
Oh boy.
What? Well, you know what? No, y'all can't see my screen regardless. This ain't gonna work. Hold on.
You have to do an acapella.
Hey, Dr.
Right.
Come on. You got the words without them slides.
Shut up, you. I mean, I'm sorry, Doctor. It says I'm screen sharing. That's odd.
You are.
Oh, okay. Well, there you go. Why didn't you tell me? All right. First of all, we must internalize the flatulation of the matter by transmitting the effervescence of the Indonesian proximity in order to further segregate the crux of my venereal infection. Now, if I may retain my liquids here for, oh wait, that's not the right slide. My bad. So we were asked to answer a question about anti-Blackness and technology. So let me pull a little bit from my book and my research, as my esteemed colleagues preceding me have done. There's a growing school of Black studies and critical Black media scholars who argue that if there's joy to be found in Blackness, it should probably be located in its resistance to social death, a foundational concept for Afro-pessimism. Defined as a denial of political life in the Western Civic Project, from this perspective, everything associated with Black bodies and the Black experience becomes resistance, for assimilation to the hegemonic culture is tantamount to accepting death. Let me be clear, resistance in and of itself does not make a life worth living. While racism and white supremacist ideologies define my everyday life, they are not the entirety of my existence. because resistance alone is not capable of creating the surplus net resources necessary to have a full life. These can only be created in the moments where we are allowed to dream, to dance, to cry, or to feel joy. So in my book, Distributed Blackness, I talk about libidinal economies because I believe that the libidinal is one way to understand our excess of life in every venue, but particularly the digital. Libidinal economy, as defined by Lyotard, describes the emotional impulses and desires powering the movements, the machinations of political economy. And here his signal term, jouissance, refers to an enjoyment of use and excess of life, the seeking of pleasures and desires of play and of climax. Frank Wilderson, one of the avatars of Afro-pessimism, notes that libidinal economy is linked not only to forms of attraction, affection, and alliance, but also to aggression, destruction, and the violence of lethal consumption. For those of you who are concerned or interested in digital blackface, this is definitely where Wilderson is coming from. Lyotard goes on to argue that political economy forecloses these pleasures, this excess of life, because it claims that if a thing cannot be exchanged, how does one value love or passion, right? Or consider the futility of Valentine's Day in expressing a true relationship? It has no value and does not exist on the market. But he continues to say their lack of exchange value in the regime of capital does not negate their existence nor their effect. Right? My argument for libidinal economies of digital practice draws from Black feminist epistemology's grounding of Black women's bodies and lived experience as a source of knowledge. Specifically, I'm engaging with Joan Morgan's Black feminist politics of pleasure, where she asks how desire, agency, and Black women's engagement with pleasure can be developed into a viable theoretical paradigm. While doing so, she argues for Black female interiority as the broad range of feelings, desires, yearnings, erotic and otherwise, that were once deemed necessarily private by the politics of silence. I answer Morgan's call for a viable theoretical paradigm by presenting Black online interiority as a way of understanding how Black embodiment and jouissance vivifies online experience. To go back to the original question, one such application of libidinal economy to race and racial ideology comes from Fred Moten, the MacArthur Genius Grant winner, and Frank Wilderson. They identify anti-Blackness as the libidinal economy of American modernity, writing that Blackness overdetermines the embodiment of impossibility, incoherence, and incapacity. And in my previous research stream, I've talked about how Black Twitter has been deemed all of those things once folk realized that Black people were using it to express themselves, right? The devaluation and the reduction of the human body to its potential for labor is clearest when the body is Black. Wilderson's Afro-pessimism rests upon the argument that Blackness is a structural position of non-communicability in the face of all other positions. And this can also be understood as Black life lived in the social death exterior to civil society. I acknowledge the power of Afro-pessimism as a theoretical construct, but I fail to see its productive application for investigating the passions and liveliness of Black Twitter or TikTok or digital practice specifically, or Black life in general. Jared Sexton argues powerfully that Afro-pessimism by necessity includes an affirmation of Blackness or an affirmation of pathological being, and should be seen as a refusal to distance oneself from Blackness and a valorization of minor differences that bring one closer to health, life, or sociality. But joy is not the valorization of minor difference. So I am these claims, these arguments that I mount against Afro-pessimism and to a lesser extent anti-Blackness place me firmly in the camp of the Afro-optimist, which is not as happy as it sounds. Succinctly stated, Afro-optimism is a position that Black life, and I'm totally quoting Moten here, like why change the words of the master? Black life, which is as surely to say life that is thought, life as Black thought is to say thought, is irreducibly social. That moreover, Black life is lived in political death, or that it is lived, if you will, in the burial ground of the subject by those who, insofar as they are not subjects, are also not in the interminable, as opposed to the last analysis, death bound. Moten continues, our aim, even in the face of the brutally imposed difficulties of Black life, is cause for celebration. This is not because celebration is supposed to make us feel good or make us feel better, though there would be nothing wrong with that. It is rather because the cause for celebration turns out to be the condition of possibility of Black thought, which animates the Black operations that will produce the absolute overturning, the absolute turning of this motherfucker out. If Afro-pessimism is structural non-communicability, then Black technoculture, which is the focus of my book, and that Black technoculture is in many ways founded upon my observations of Black Twitter refutes that stance, both culturally and digitally, through practice, discourse, and an excess of life. That's it. Nice and short. Lots of big words, but nice and short. Your turn, Safiya. Oh, I don't have no slides.
I got it. Calm down. All right. Don't. Well, let me just say that this is, of course, everyone knows that this is going to be terrible after following those three. So I'm just going to set it up powerfully here and say that I'm so thrilled to be in this conversation with this community and with all of you who are attending and watching. And, you know, I was thinking about this conversation and this time, and I'm going to keep my remarks very brief because I really want to get to the conversation. But, you know, thinking about my own work, you know, why we need Black Studies. Of course, this talk being hosted by the Center for Black Studies at Santa Barbara is so grateful to be having these conversations, quite frankly, in the context of Black Studies is so remarkable to me. And I know for many of us who are on this panel, you know, I think back to the time that Dr. Tediga was on my dissertation committee, and I can remember talking to her about my work, which eventually became this book, Algorithms of Oppression. And you know, knowing that I was pushing a boulder, so to speak, up a mountain, that's really how I think of it. And I think about that boulder now having kind of tipped over the tipping point and just being a part of a huge momentum of people like those who are on this panel and so many others and many who are watching today. You know, what that's like to center Blackness in conversations about technology and information. And of course, for those of us who've been trying to do that, we know what a struggle it has been to decenter the technology, decenter the algorithm, decenter the AI, and to politicize it, quite frankly, in the context of a critique of systemic racism, structural inequality, and of course, its underlying logics of white supremacy. And this is something that I've certainly been spending, you know, the better part of this last decade trying to do. And so it's amazing to be in a position now where we can have these kinds of panels also in our own, quite frankly, cultural context, you know, that we can laugh and bring our own sensibility at a time when the performative landscape of being able to talk about these things is always set in the terms of a hegemonic kind of academic framework that devalues Black studies and devalues Black academics and Black people and traditions. So I want to just say that as a kind of an opening salvo to why this panel means so much to me personally. And you know that y'all know I get to crying, so I'm just going to keep it together right now and not go there. You know, we're at a point now where we can openly have these conversations about the mounting harms that are amassing against Black people, against Indigenous people. It's stunning to see headline after headline in the news now about the ways in which technologies, digital technologies, and when I'm talking about technologies, I'm really talking about networked digital technologies, internet-based technologies, as opposed to other types of technologies. And you know, I think that it truly, I make this claim all the time, that it has been the Black and the people of color and the LGBTQ scholars and journalists who have centered these conversations about harm over the last decade. Indeed, I don't even think we would be able to have these types of conversations had Black scholars in particular not been doing the work of, again, redefining the paradigms. And I think that, one of the things that I want to talk about for just a few minutes is what does it mean to set a new paradigm, a paradigm that puts Black people in the epicenter, our concerns, our cares, our dreams, our worries, our futures, and our past, in a place where we can apprehend and talk about the relationship between all of that and the digital. And so here's like my page. I mean, these are our modern ancestors, but I think about and love to share this slide, especially when students are participating in conversations with us, because I think it's so important that we know that there is a canon, quite frankly, now of Black scholars who are, again, in a variety of different kinds of, either in the center or in the edges of Black studies, talking about the concerns that I think are central to the future of all humanity, as far as I'm concerned. Because if you look at the people upon whom so many digital technologies are deployed, beta tested, tried out, how narratives are constructed in relationship to Black people, you see that our presence and even our erasure is absolutely central to the ideologies and the practices of the digital. And so here you have, someone as early as, Craig Watkins talking about Black teenagers not in fact being digitally divided, but being power users of the digital, and writing that work at a time when the nation was expressly at the level of the White House arguing that Black people were on the wrong side of the technology divide, and that we were in fact pathologized as a means to build a national internet infrastructure. Quite frankly, I mean, this becomes a rationale, the pathologizing of Black people and Black youth and our lack of connectivity as also, if you look at kind of the political economy of it, as a rationale for huge transfers of wealth, which continue through this day from the public sector to the private sector to build these infrastructures that are allegedly about curing some divided pathological state of Black people and poor people. And so I think these things are important to remember when we read into the political economy of the internet, that we understand the narratives and the ideologies. And here we have Craig, speaking so powerfully back into that narrative. Now I know this, many of us on this Zoom, we remember, in my high school when pagers were what's up. The only people in Fresno, California, where I grew up, who had pagers, beepers, were surgeons who worked at the hospital and the brothers in my high school. I mean, that's just what's up. So I think it's really interesting, again, the way in which so many ideas have come forward about, and this is where I love, Andre, your work around the creative unintended uses of the technologies that are not designed for us, and the ways that we apprehend those and use them to our strength. And so, so many people on this page, are really responsible. Anna Everett at UCSB, I mean, just being, an intellectual godmother of counter narrating our existence into the development of what we think of as kind of the modern day internet. And I think these stories are so important. Alondra Nelson, I mean, I have a personal story about every person on this page and how important all of you have been to my own intellectual development. And so I think it's just, I want to shout out these folks. Let me just say, quickly that one of the reasons why I write about technologies kind of from the perspective of having been trained in an information school. In fact, I went to Illinois, and Andre was a few years ahead of me in getting the PhD. We have a lot of interesting stories. I remember that when Andre was an assistant professor at the University of Iowa, and he heard that I got admitted to the information school at Illinois, he just cold called me and rang me up and was like, yo, I got you. I got you. I know what you're about to enter, and I'm going to help see you through this. And so, there's so many ways in which we are all doing this work together in visible and invisible ways. And of course, what was so interesting to me as I was studying in the kind of tradition of information science and library and information science is that these underlying models for binary classification systems are predicated upon, centuries old binary logics that always predicate a hierarchy of power, where Blackness is used as the anchor to bolster whiteness, Europeanity, all of the kinds of histories of course, Dr. Benjamin being, our resident expert in the histories of science studies. But, these are very important logics that we have to understand, because these become the basis for binary logics that then get naturalized, normalized, and used as the mathematical logics for a whole host of digital technologies that we are using now. And so I think it's important for us to get at the level of code and programming languages to think about what other ways, what might we imagine relations, power relations, how might we dismantle power relations in a way that gets reflected in coding? And of course, that means we have to challenge binary logics that can ascribe a 1 or a 0 to a black or a white, to a male or a female, that erase any possibilities for alternate imaginaries. And I think this is really important. Of course, those are predicated upon the subordination of Blackness in these logics. And you see these over and over again in a variety of different projects. So kind of the last thing I want to say is, as I think about the future of where my work is going, I've been so inspired by Professor Benjamin's, book, which I have right here, and thinking about abolition as a framework for my own work. I mean, we're living in a time where people are arguing for things like AI and ethics. And I will tell you that, I reject this, because I think that the depoliticizing and the defanging of the critiques of Black scholars about the digital is actually the emergence of this notion of AI and ethics, right? It's the depoliticizing, it's the return to the neoliberal framework that these problems are at the level of individual value systems, that there is in fact a clear value, and you are either respectful of that value and ethical, or you are not, and you are unethical. And this completely depoliticizes our ability to have a structural analysis of these problems, and to, again, center the ways in which anti-Blackness becomes, for me, I relate to the AI and ethics kind of movement, this kind of cottage industry within academia that's emerging, when it so explicitly denies in the spaces and places where it denies how anti-Blackness is working in those spaces. Those movements are really bolstering anti-Blackness, because they obfuscate our ability to have the kinds of critiques that all of us here on this panel have deployed in a variety of different capacities. So I'll remind us that, we believe that millions of people have to change their minds, that hundreds of thousands of people have to learn how to code. All those things are perfectly reasonable things to want. But I think that it was truly the abolitionists who worked and who taught us so much in the abolition of the transatlantic slave trade and the institution of slavery in the United States that we have so much in the Americas, quite frankly, who've taught us so much about how a small number of people, quite frankly, relative to the millions of people who are both enslaved and captured and the millions of people who benefit from that capture and from our enslavement, are able to actually transform paradigms. And this is the thing that makes me feel so incredibly hopeful about the work that we're all doing. I see us as a bit of maybe a cabal of abolitionists who are pointing to the contradictions of the promises of technology and indeed leveraging those contradictions to throw a significant weight of resistance against the many, many problems that we know about the way in which digital technologies are weaponized against us. So, in a more recent context, we will recall that it was a small handful of activists and health practitioners and all kinds of folks who helped us understand the harms, for example, of big tobacco. And in that model, I mean, I tell you, when I'm with my student, I try to explain to them how when I was born, I'm sure the doctor had a cigarette hanging from his mouth. And I'm pretty sure my mom chain smoked 2 packs of cigarettes after she pushed me out. And, this was the 70s, and people cannot imagine that that's what was going down. But in fact, that was so normative that people couldn't even understand. They couldn't even recognize the secondary and tertiary effects of the harms of big tobacco. And again, it was a handful of people who really took on the tobacco-sponsored research and the paradigm setting that industry did to really shift the landscape. And so I want to remind us that the discourses of big cotton and the discourses and practices of big tobacco are very similar to the kinds of things we see in big tech. So we have a huge opportunity, and I consider it a privilege to get to be able to work on challenging these paradigms and working with my panelists in that tradition. And so I think I'll leave it there and say thank you so much for inviting me today.
All right, well, so we've been on here for about an hour. So per the schedule, it technically would be Q&A time. We have a few questions here. I think some of them are interesting. One that I think I want to get to first is this question from Christopher Holdley. He asked, talk a bit about the differences between how we can try to root out anti-Blackness in technology design in the tech industry versus rooting it out in tech design that happens in academia.
Yeah, so I'll jump in on that, and I welcome my wonderful colleagues' thoughts too. But I personally think of academia pedagogy as the ground zero for seeding paradigms, to draw on Safiya's comments. And so when it comes to whatever the dominant frameworks are now, we can look to academia as one of their sources. And so if we're thinking about changing them, we also need to look there. One of the things I think a lot of people don't realize is when we think of some of the most harmful forms of carceral technologies, in particular, whether we're talking about predictive policing or risk assessments, et cetera, the intellectual foundations of these technologies begin in academia. And they don't simply begin on the STEM side of academia, which is also perhaps a misunderstanding. But in fact, social scientists, in particular, we can look to anthropology at UCLA, and as one of the key architects of predictive policing that LAPD uses, grows out of the work of an anthropologist at UCLA. And we can look at other universities. All of our, nowhere is clean. So if we begin to understand how harmful and carceral technologies rely on their legitimacy, they rely on the sort of basic research foundations that are in our own backyard, to me, then it becomes imperative that we understand that academia is already politicized. We're already complicit. So it's not a matter of choosing whether to be or not, it's to decide what side you're on. And it's my role and our role as a collective really to think about producing the intellectual foundations for countering and resisting carcerality and carceral technologies, but also imagining and seeding a different conception altogether, a different paradigm altogether in terms of thinking about technology. So it's both the critical foundations and the creative practices and foundations that I see us as trying to foster. And so again, let's think about this boundary between, in academia, the private sector, government. It's so porous and promiscuous. One of my students this week in class, in the chat of the seminar, they said one of the things they tell each other as students, they ask each other rather, they're all seniors, they say, are you going to stay in academia or are you going to sell out? That's what they ask each other, as if it's not possible to sell out in academia. And so again, that's a false choice when we think about how we're actually using the space, the resources to either bolster business as usual or seed alternatives, see counter imaginaries that can actually produce the world that we need to live in.
I'll jump in on that question too, right where you left off, Ruha, and picking up really on everything that Safiya said, which is, there is, to me, little distinction between how we do this in academia and how we do this in industry in terms of the design of technology. Because I think in both places, we've got to do the same things. And that is, number one, we have to figure out a way to centralize Blackness within our understandings about technology, the history, the present of technology, and starting from that particular vantage point to unlearn in some ways and learn about this thing in a different way. On the flip side, I think we have to grapple with anti-Blackness, something that I don't think that we do in academia, certainly not in the spaces where we're talking about and thinking through issues of technology. And that similarly has to be done in industry if we're going to hold out any hope that things will be different. And so both of those questions run through, I think, this answer, which is, can we do either? Can we fully, everybody think on this presentation today, where on your campus is this conversation happening? Hasn't happened on mine that I've seen, or at least not very often. And so until the time that this type of interrogation is the fundamental basis of our discussions about technology, I don't think we can think about ways things will significantly change.
We have anybody else who wants to hop in on that? All right, well then
I always got something to say. So one of the first things I want to say in answer to this really good question, rooting out anti-Blackness in design and in the academy, is that number one, representation will not save us, right? That getting more, I stole that from you, getting more Black people in these spaces, either academic or corporate, without accompanying structures to support, retain, and vivify them will not do anything to root out structures of anti-Blackness. You're basically just feeding them into a sawmill so that you can make them into Soylent Green, right? You're not really doing anything to help those people. So that's one. The other part is that because I operate from a libidinal economic perspective, I would like to change the refrain for putting young Black kids in coding camps and boot camps and stuff. Change it from the idea that you're not gonna get no job, like you're about to lose your job. Like I wanna change that mindset. I wanna allow Black kids to enjoy STEM and fail at STEM at the same rates and capacities and ability to recover that their white cohorts have. Right? Because in many cases, our Black kids feel like they have to do this technology. And if they don't, they are not going to be successful. And I want them to be able to take it on like many of the folk I saw when Black Planet was a thing, right? Where there were 13-year-olds making $60,000 a year building templates for Black Planet and MySpace websites, right? They didn't do it because they wanted to become coders or wanted to become CEOs. They were doing it because they absolutely enjoyed making stuff for their people. And I think that's something that needs to be reincorporated in not only the boot camps that we love to set, like Black Girls Code, but trying to build a way to build that into trying to find a way to build that into our pedagogies for STEM instruction, for digital humanities instruction, and then trying to figure out how to get that taken up in the tech industry. Because tech industry, you have to realize, and this comes from talking with Omar Warsal about Black Planet, the VCs do a lot of determining over who's going to be in tech, right? In terms of, if you're a Black entrepreneur and you bring this dope idea, hey, let me come up with an app to show the location of every beauty salon in East Atlanta, right? In many cases, VCs will be like, that's just a niche project. We couldn't fund that. We don't see it to scale. In the meantime, somebody says, you know what the world needs? A $300 interconnected juicer. They'd be like, oh my God, I've always wanted something like that. That's not niche at all, right? And so there's something to be said beyond rooting out anti-Blackness in the tech industry, but rooting out anti-Blackness in the ancillary industries that feed into the tech industry, right? That stuff has to be done as well. And so what we're talking about, and somebody made a really dope comment in the thing, I think it was about Walter Rodney, right? We cannot fix anti-Blackness in the entire world. We cannot decolonize the entire world at once. We have to kind of take it on step by step, institution by institution, right? And so the things I say to STEM educators, but also to students who are interested in STEM, find your joy and find ways to bring that joy to your pedagogy, right? Which is not as easy as it sounds. Many STEM curriculums are 4 straight years of coding with 1 composition course and 1 ethics course, right? There's really no space for the joy outside of that technical practice, right? But find ways to incorporate joy through those curriculum and Blackness, as Charlton brings out. And I think you'll begin to see a change in the types of people who get into these spaces, their resilience to the fury of anti-Blackness in those spaces, and a flowering of talent and innovation in those spaces.
Yeah, I'll just add that the one thing that I think is so important is that, again, we center other epistemologies even in the framework of STEM. The problem has been exactly what Andre's talking about, which is this idea of representation, that if we get more Black people, more brown people, more women, that we will solve it. But we don't solve the, the epistemological approaches that are in those fields. So let's say, that provosts are watching this today. I know there's a real impulse to want to hire more Black people in science, technology, engineering, and math. And in this moment of the kind of call for the support of Black Lives Matter and all the statements that have been coming out of academia, leadership of universities, this idea that we just hire more Black mathematicians is somehow solving the response and the call. Indeed, what people are calling for is for people who work in these areas, all kinds of areas throughout academia, to center Black life, to center the study of Black life and the needs of Black people in ways that resolve and solve systemic structural racism and injustice, including economic inequality. So you can't just have a Black person who, that is that struggle has been real. And that is a struggle, let's say, that we've been in for 100 years in academia. But now we're we've evolved our conversation. And now we're talking about how do we center the study of Black life, which is, of course, what this panel is about, sponsored by a Center for Black Studies. How do we center Black life in these STEM fields? That actually then results in very different projects, very different research agendas, very different possibilities and interventions. And that's actually, again, a shift from just a matter of hiring more Black people who are, quite frankly, trained against and away from humanities and social sciences. For any of us on this panel who have taught computer science students, for example, we know that many of our first and second year computer science students have AP tested out of English, who are rolling on some high school level humanities sometimes when they're graduating from college. This is unacceptable. You know, I tell my students all the time, you have no business designing technology for society, and you know nothing about society. So these are the kinds of questions I think that we're talking about when we say, how do we shift a paradigm in STEM?
That's a great answer. I really like that. I think so there's two questions roughly around this idea, and I wanted to ask maybe because it's just timely right now. So one of the questions is, with the uncertainty surrounding the COVID-19 vaccine distribution plan, do you think an oversight committee to vet proper distribution to people in communities of color is a good idea? If so, how could they be put together? Another one is talking about, where can we place the current COVID-19 tracing apps that the UC and others are running right now? How can we place that kind of technology, a voluntary monitoring within this conversation about technology and race?
So I'll jump in. I personally think it's useful to use the same kinds of frameworks, critiques, and exercises, kind of mental exercises that we apply to algorithms and emerging technologies, to think also about vaccines, contact tracing, in particular, the issue of technical fixes for what are complex social realities and problems. And so the same type of, it's understandable, right? We have relatives, we have friends who are suffering either through the direct, cause of COVID, or all of the ripple effects in terms of work and education, et cetera. So the desire for quick fixes is strong, right? Even perhaps more so than the quick fixes promised through various kind of automated systems, et cetera. But similarly, the road to hell is paved with technical fixes. And so we really have to balance support and investment in vaccines, in effective contact tracing, with a deep, deep investment and respect and understanding of the importance of the many different fields and forms of social activity that are going to get us to the other side of this pandemic. It's not going to be a silver bullet that's coming out of a lab, because even if these vaccines have 100% effectiveness and last a long time, human beings, social reality assures us that it's not going to be taken up in the same way. And so we just need to look at the history of racism in medicine to understand why the distrust is warranted. So the onus is on powerful institutions to demonstrate their trustworthiness, one. And so when it comes to directly to this question about committees to oversee, that may play some role in thinking about what a kind of infrastructure will look like. But really, I think we have to think about how are we going to grow public trust, and not just trust in government. That's not what I mean. But I mean a sense of not just trust, but also a sense of care for one another, that my actions, actually what I choose to do, really has impact on everyone. And so right now, what we're inundated with is a rhetoric of freedom, which is the freedom not to care about other people, the freedom to make decisions and to hell with their effect on others. And so we're up against a real challenge that no vaccine, no effective contact tracing is going to be able to penetrate that, how toxic that discourse and that ideology of unvarnished, uninhibited freedom of individual freedom is, and how that is going to ensure our extinction, right? And so essentially the point is that we need to think carefully about what has to be regenerated in terms of our social fabric that would allow a vaccine or contact tracing or other things to actually be effective. Those things are not going to save us.
I love that. I just want to add to this that, with respect to contact tracing and other kinds of technologies that are coming to the fore right now, that, I wrote a piece for Noema magazine recently about this, which was really, I hoped, trying to show how the tech industry in particular, along with other industries, but in particular, this industry has really profited. Charlton, I love that you're just like, I need scotch for this. It's cool. It's fine. I saw it. It's cool. I need it too. We're at a moment where we sit, and the only sector that's making money right now while 40 million people are unemployed is the tech sector. And what we see is that this sector, for the most part, doesn't pay taxes. It offshores most of its profits and doesn't recirculate them back in to the economy. It has such a uneven supply chain in terms of the distribution of labor and resources, in terms of who's contracted out to the lowest possible wages in the global South and in the United States, quite frankly, and who benefits. And yet there's this fantasy of the kind of the software engineer and the C-suite that this is the tech sector. But what indeed the tech sector has done has defunded all of the kinds of institutions that we need so desperately at a moment where we're facing a global pandemic. So if you don't pay taxes into the system, then you defund public education. We know that this is that public education is in crisis right now during COVID-19. You defund public higher education. You defund the resources we need for public health infrastructures. You defund public libraries. I could go on, public media. And you create the conditions then to rush in with your techno solutionism and your contact tracing apps and your ways to make money. I mean, dare I say, and I'm looking at this now, I think we will look a year from now, 2 years from now, and we'll see more money spent in IT budgets in education than we saw spent on professors and teachers and the staff that's needed to make education work. And so these are the kinds of crises, the crisis points that we also have to look at if we're going to talk about contact tracing. Contact tracing might help us certainly to apprehend the spread. But what will really apprehend the spread are robust systems of care, as Dr. Benjamin was talking about. And I think these are the kinds of things that have been completely decimated. All of the kinds of unraveling of public trust and the fabric of the fragile democratic institutions that we have really been catastrophically harmed by this sector. And there's no denying that. We have the evidence. So I think we're going to have to solve these things at the level of public policy intervention. We need a repatriation of those profits back into the economy and into democratic institutions. We need to elect people who are literate on these issues, quite frankly. We need maybe a bunch of people from this panel need to be special advisors in the new White House. I don't know, but we need a lot of things and a lot of interventions that far eclipse the contact tracing app. And we cannot allow contact tracing apps or any other kinds of technologies to be the alleged solution. I'll take my drink now, Charlton.
Professor Rock, you want to add? Professor Rock, you want to add something? All right. Let's see. So here's a question, because I'm also curious about this too. We have a question that says, Dr. Benjamin, I read your book recently and found this idea of race itself as a technology really compelling. I was wondering if you and the other panelists could say a little bit more about that.
Sure, I'll kick it off, and then I won't put pressure on my panelists, co-panelists to necessarily say anything. It's up to you all. And so really there, I'm writing against a couple different conceptions or reductions of what racism is. And so race as a technology builds on the work of other colleagues who've come before, who've deployed that notion to different ends. but drawing on a literature that's thinking about the practical and practice aspect of how racism is perpetuated, rather than just ill feelings at the individual level or individual animus, but also not simply thinking about it as a static set of laws or policies. So thinking about how each of us engenders racism, in our everyday internal monologues, interpersonal interactions, and then our roles in various institutions. And so thinking about it as a technology, both is pointing attention to that active element, but also leaves room for how we can do things differently, right? And so it's trying to move away from a reductive aspect of this is always the way things are. And so in particular, I'm influenced by Afrofuturist thought and just the idea that we can all be in the same space looking at the same object, but through race as a technology, we can be experiencing parallel realities, right? We can see very different things and have very different experiences. And so really thinking about the idea of parallel worlds and parallel realities, and how, for example, housing segregation can create that effect in one city or one town, where kids can grow up in very different realities, or the same school and tracking can do the same thing and create very different parallel realities in terms of the education system, or in terms of our health insurance structure. You can go to the same hospital, but depending on what your insurance is, you might have a very different experience of what healthcare is and how you're treated. And so these are the ways in which race as a technology helps to show how these parallel experiences or hierarchical experiences can be produced. And so there, the attention is not just to name what the problem is, but also encourage us to think about what we do now that we feel like we can wield it to different ends in terms of racial imaginaries and cultural imaginaries that may be more liberatory.
How are we supposed to follow that?
+1.
She be killing me, y'all. Like, she just dropped these genius bombs in the conversation, and then I'm just like, yes, you are absolutely correct, Dr. Benjamin. I'm so happy to be here with you, because right. It's just feel like all I need to do all night is like this.
If we were in the same room, your shoulder would be so hurt right now. You would box so many times. You're lucky. You better thank Zoom. Thank Zoom.
You had your chance when me, you, Doomy, and Charlton were in the same room. You missed it.
Right.
All right, well, I guess since nobody wants to follow that, she got too many buckets on that. We'll move on to the next question. And I'll ask one more question, and then I have a final question in here that I really like. So how would you all like to see policy adapt to the research you're doing and can policy measures, interact with academia to remedy anti-Blackness in technology?
I mean, Safiya got funding. Charlton and CRDS has funding. I'm pretty sure if Ruha asked for it, she could get funding. So I think the policy folk are already starting to pay attention to the initiatives that we have. What exactly do y'all mean? Like we could bring Matali Nakande on this panel, right, to talk more about policy initiatives, but what exactly do you mean by policy? Policy in what venue? Policy to what end? Do you want a Voting Rights Act for tech activism, right? Like someone in that framework? Like, I'm not sure. And I asked this because thinking back to the contact tracing app question, like one of the things I'm writing now about the Black paranoid tradition, because I feel like it has a lot of relevance to today's misinformation, disinformation arguments. And like, we are justifiably fearful of what technologies have been used to do to us in the medical realm specifically, but overall, like Virginia Eubank's book on the welfare system in Philadelphia, right? So we know that those things don't promise good things for us, but what is the alternative? What policies would make those things act better, right? And I don't know if that's a policy fix. That's why I keep going back to this libidinal economy. Like, we need to change the beliefs about who and what Black people are and can be, right? Before we can start worrying about what policy did. And I'll give you a really compelling yet terrible example. George Floyd got murdered this summer. a lot of people said they wanted to bring in new Black hires and do all sorts of POC recruitment strategies. And they even posted Black squares on Instagram. What policy motive came out of that? Right. And so policy is not going to save us. Although I think we need to put our efforts towards getting policies that will help us at some point. That's not something that Black folk have ever been historically able to depend on. And even when we get some, whiteness works to continually pull it back, pull it back, pull it back. Like one of the most compelling things I saw when people, because right now we have this conversation on canceling student debt. And it reminded me so much of the New Deal when they instituted this system of welfare payments to everybody but the industries that Black people were most prominent in. Right? No welfare, no domestic workers, and no agricultural workers. Right? And so that excluded the vast majority of Black people. That's what policy is and does in this current white supremacist American moment, liberal or conservative. Right? And so we have to build our Bronzevilles. We have to build our Black Wall Streets. We have to build out these spaces that can then, without applying respectability politics to it, which is difficult, right? But that can then basically support the initiatives that we have to make things for us, by us. But that's a dream. That's an Afrofuturist dream, I would argue, Ruha, because I mean, it's been tried. But I always will say, I will always keep trying, regardless of the fact that I know that these efforts are doomed to being stymied in some sense or fashion. We should still keep trying on an everyday basis. Sorry, I got ranty.
I want you to say more, Andre. If policy is not the fix, then what, in terms of that outpouring of joy, these other kinds of expressions that we saw post George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and so forth, those everyday expressions that reified our sense of Blackness and identity and value that came out of that, what does that give us in terms of an answer? So
I'll put it to you like this. What policies led to the support and succor of Black churches for civil rights activists or runaway slaves? Black churches believed in a politics and ethics of care, right? An ethos of care, right? And I believe that ethos of care will in the long run be more self-sustaining to us, even on a technological basis, right? Than any policy will be in the long term. As long as we don't have control of the levers of power, that will always be an imperfect solution, right? And so institutions, and this is shout out to Kenitra Brooks, right? Spirituality definitely has something to do with the things that we are interested in implementing through technology. There is no technical fix, but there is a techno-cultural answer to the problematics that we have to deal with on an everyday basis.
Okay, I gotta get on this because I'm trash talking you a little bit, Andre, in the chat, because
please.
I mean, I think we have to have policy, and policy does work in some limited capacity, the same way that storytelling shifts culture one story at a time. We have to do both. We know, for example, that let's take local politics in Los Angeles. We just passed Measure J. It was a massive defund the police measure that was about shifting resources, redistributing resources to social welfare, affordable housing, and other kinds of concerns. So I think we have to pay attention to policy. Of course, there is no one magic bullet piece of legislation, but there is definitely, policy is also a side of domain and a side of struggle that is worth it in terms of the distribution of resources. When you talk about repair and restoration, there have to be mechanisms to do that. And policy is, in fact, one of those mechanisms, because that's how budgets, that's how dollars get moved from one set of priorities to other kinds of priorities. So I think we can't abandon that site or say that policies like, policies for politics or for Washington. And I'm not saying you're saying that, but I am saying that there's a space for doing the work for people who are committed and can enact civil and human and sovereign rights models that happen through those legal and policy frameworks. And those are important places. Those have actually been the site of, civil rights work in the United States for Black people has mostly been in these legal policy spaces. So that part we don't want to abandon, but I think we also, of course, we need culture and storytelling and paradigm shifting that has to happen and coincide with that. So I guess I just want to not leave people watching this panel in a space where they're like, you know, it doesn't matter if we vote. It doesn't matter if we care about policy, because we do need to care about policy. It doesn't mean we have to put all our eggs in that basket, but we got to carry that basket still.
I love trolling.
Stir up a little.
Ozzy, you got more questions for us?
I got one more question because we're about to go over time, but so I like this broad question I see here. When you think about the interplay of race and technology, what is the ideal future that each of you envision/dream of? Let's end on this note.
Well, I'll kick it off. I want a future free from the past predicting the future. I think that so many of the kinds of technologies that many of us are studying and looking at are really about shrinking agency, the agency of people and communities, of countries, of possibilities. You know, if you take data from the past and you train your machine learning algorithms on it, you predict the past into the future. There's just no getting around that. And so I think, you know, it's no coincidence to me that at the moment when the Civil Rights Act was passed in 1964 and people of color, Black people in particular, have, you know, a modicum of decision-making power in limited spheres of society, that the rise of a ideology that computing and technology can somehow make better decisions than the people who have been enfranchised. That's not lost on me. So I think we have to think about the futures that are not overdetermined by the past, but that also reconcile and restore what has been lost, what has been taken, what what imaginaries that we could have that often get foreclosed by not only the trauma of the past, but the lack of resources. All the ways in which, you know, Black people have built and rebuilt and built again, had it stolen, had it burned down, had it taken away, come back to the again and again. I mean, I would like to imagine a future where we get to build the kinds of communities and lives and futures that we want that aren't, again, always overdetermined by the violence of white supremacy and the violence of, anti-Blackness.
Anybody else have a future they see?
I'm trying to go last. So
y'all let him go last because he's gonna say something.
I'll help you out, Andre. You can go last. I'm gonna glom on to Safiya once again and say, really self-determination, right? And and I'm coming from this, been thinking about over the last few days and doing some writing about, the persistent tech industry fix to getting better technology of, training more Black and people of color technologists and, the coding boot camps and all of these fixes that we know well about. And in that context, I'm thinking I would love to see an IBM, I would love to see a Google, I would love to see one of these giant tech companies invest in Black young people to the degree that they have the ability to choose what it is they want to do. To say, here is a bucket of money for you to have the best education you can get, and I want you to then go and be a social worker, and that be okay. So having a sense in which we have an investment in people's lives that really is about self-determination and not about doing something good for an industry or fixing a problem that we have spent so much time making for ourselves and then forcing that problem and the fix and the responsibility to solve that on new generations.
I don't think I can follow that. I'm gonna shut up now. Ruha, you got something?
I don't really. I just want to stand in line to get into your futures that you just described. Where do I apply? You know, I think anytime I'm asked a question about the future, for me, it's really about hoping and working for open futures where people's futures are not so overdetermined by the past and by structures outside of them. So it goes to what Charlton said in terms of self-determination. It goes to what Safiya said in terms of the past not predicting the future. And I really want a future where we get to make mistakes. And so again, it's not an idealized, you know, Wakanda. It's a place where we hurt each other, but we know how to heal each other. It's a place where people are held accountable when they do harm, and we don't rely on a punishment apparatus. So it's a future without policing and prisons. And so it's a future in which we can be human, fully human, make mistakes, you know, mess up, but where then your life doesn't get torn apart or prematurely foreclosed just because you're human, you know, just because you make mistakes. And so you know, it's really a messy future, but where we value life so much that we work together to try to, you know, really just try to come back from those moments in which we, you know, we hurt and we don't live up even to our own expectations. And so, you know, it's a humble and messy future. And I think anyone who promises something that is over idealized, I go back again and again to Toni Morrison, who talks about how utopias are built by those who are not allowed in. And so if it's idealized, there's going to be forms of exclusion and debasement on which those ideals rest. And so I don't want that.
Love you.
Y'all be making my job difficult. So I'm gonna stand up for a second. Y'all see this sweatshirt I have on? Can y'all see it? Can y'all see it? I should probably take the background off.
Read it
Right,
because
but it's
the background.
Yeah.
Zoom hates us.
Let me show y'all my messy ass. Here we go. So shout out to Auntie Peebs if she's ever going to watch this. I finally got my sweatshirt, my Black Girls of Magic sweatshirt. And I stand up to show this because I get frustrated when people ask me, where is the future? I am very much anti-utopian because I think, as Ruha really just brilliantly pointed out, the utopias are usually built by people who aren't allowed to be in them, right? And so in many cases, when I hear Black folk ask for utopias, they ask for some space that is absent of the very things that made us the dope people that we are. Right, which is why I love Kashawn Thompson's articulation of Black Girls Are Magic, because it is very much a narration of people who are making the best they can out of what they have. And while some people would like to call that struggle, right, I also think of it as an immensely generative space where you have to have the additional creativity to make your life better because you weren't given everything at once, right? In some ways, a utopia to me, and this came out of the abolition conversations this summer on Black Twitter. In some ways, utopia to me sounds like a white suburb. You know, a place where white kids can do drugs and not go to jail, a place where they can get mortgage exemptions on McMansions because they made a lot of money on the stock market, where they don't have the police following them around the street. You know what I'm saying? Like all these things that white people just expect. That's what I think people hear for utopia. And what I would rather have is the messiness that Ruha really, again, brilliantly pointed out. What things do we do now that bring you joy? Would you want to be part of a utopia? Right. And so this is why I ride so hard for Black Twitter, right? Even though many people, especially women who I give them full credit, women's sociality on social media can be trash. Like the fleets on Twitter are really exposing a lot of people's DMs to trash ass people at this moment, right? But in other ways, Black Twitter is that space I go to when I'm really feeling terrible about my day and somebody posts something just makes me crack up laughing and fall out my chair. There are very few other spaces, distributed, virtual, real, or otherwise, that hold that capacity to at least lighten my burden for a moment. And so when I think about utopia, I want to ask for a space where we can have more of those moments in the process of becoming who we will be, as opposed to a finished utopian space where we have already become. I just want, progress isn't really the right word, just the capacity to fail, the capacity to grow, right? And to be able to acknowledge that growth and failure as part of who we are as human beings, right? So this panel has been tremendous for me, even though I troll my friends, and they are my friends, right? Because in this panel, I get to see the flowering of work that I have been doing for the last 20 years, that Ruha and Safiya and Charlton have been doing for the last 15 or so years, because I'm older than all of y'all, right? And so that Sharon was training me in at the University of Illinois in 2003, right? And so Dr. Tediga, and so this is just, I love to see that we're at this moment where all of us are right now on a stage where people listen to what we bring to the table, because they have come to understand that our cultural specificity has enabled us to have brilliant insights on the alienation of the world that they have put us in, right? And for that, I am super grateful to Dr. Tediga for bringing this panel together. I really appreciate having y'all here. Trust me, I'm trying not to cry because I'm a waterhead like Safiya. That's all I got, Ozzy.
All right, well, I appreciate you guys as panelists coming through and bringing this great conversation to me, Dr. Tediga, Dr. Wooten, and all the people in the audience. I want to thank the audience for coming by. And I want to thank Dr. Wooten and Dr. Tediga for putting this together.
Yes.